Great. I know there's probably a few people still desperately swigging that coffee or water. I'm going to start in the interest of time so that I don't interfere. If I go on long in the morning, then I'm interfering with the next presentation. So I purposely chose this slide of what I call confusion, questions, on both your side and my side. But keep this in mind, keep the questions going. Before I start the next section, which is going to be on cognitive difficulties associated with ADHD, does anybody have questions from the burning question from that first section? Yes.
At the very end of your presentation, you made some mention about medications for 6 months. I was wondering if you could just...
Sure. So the comment was, at the end of my presentation, I made a comment about medication effects for about 6 months. And why I made that statement is that the best evidence of treatment is initially derived from what we call randomized controlled trials, where a group of youngsters are randomized to receive treatment A or treatment B or what we call business as usual. And the issue with medication is that it would be, given the knowledge of the effectiveness in suppressing the symptoms, it's very difficult to do an ongoing trial that goes much longer than a few months these days. So the database that we are working from, the studies of the stimulant medication, have often not been very long. Given that this is a problem, ADHD might indeed be a lifespan problem, the evidence that is available, even with what I call follow-up studies, observation studies, is only 1 or 2 years. And the longer-term studies that have tried to follow up groups of individuals who have been prescribed and received medication for, say, a year and a bit, and they follow them up 15, 20 years later, they don't see any difference between those with or without medication. And this is the problem. It doesn't mean that it doesn't, and that's at a group level. This is always, you have to take in mind that research in general is based on a group of individuals with ADHD, and it doesn't mean that that's the case for an individual with ADHD. But a lot of it is that we don't have the data to give evidence that the effects are really long. Obviously, if you don't take that medication, it's not going to have long-lasting effects. It stops. So it can only be helpful when you take it, just like any other medication. But it's mostly that we lack a lot of long-term evidence. We've got some for other non-stimulant medication, is longer studies, but it's a very odd database, actually. So we know it's effective in suppressing symptoms for a lot of individuals for some of the time. That's all we can say, really. And it's often we have now beginning to get, as there's been different types of formulations of medication, we're getting longer evidence that it may be suppressing symptoms for longer. But even if the most effective medication and delivery medication would be developed, it is not going to be enough. It cannot possibly. Pills do not fix skill difficulties. So it always needs multimodal intervention. A lot of information, a lot of other types of approaches in the school system and so on. Medication would never be sufficient for this complex, multifactorial problem where individuals vary so much. Does that help you a bit? Thank you. I've just set aside.
Okay. Sorry, some more housekeeping. So I just wanted to clarify about this afternoon session. So Dr. Corcom's sessions this afternoon, they are 2 different sessions, one building on the other. So it is not a repeat of the same session. The other 2 sessions on executive functioning and emotional dysregulation are repeated. So they are the same sessions, but Dr. Corcom's sessions are not the identical session back to back. They're 2 separate presentations, okay? Because we had some questions about that, and Dr. Corcom wanted me to clarify that. Also, because I've had some questions, I'll just let you know this now. Next spring, April 20th to 23rd, the World Congress on ADHD will be here in Vancouver. This is the first time they're outside of Europe. This is a World International Conference on ADHD. This conference is strictly for medical professionals, but they have asked me to organize a family information day within this conference, where they're going to provide me with the venue and my choice of presenters. So we just got word of this, and I was actually just at the Vancouver Conference Center where it will be held. But we're looking at having it on the Sunday, April 23rd. So stay tuned to the CADDAC website for information for that, hopefully in the next month or two. That will be posted there as well. And if there are any physicians in attendance, if you would like CADDAC to send you resources, brochures, postcards for your office, or if you want to be on our information list, there are these sheets out on the desk. You can just fill those in and hand that out. And I think that's it for now. So back to Dr. Tannick. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, so this second part is also going to be in two parts. I'm first going to discuss with you, try to explain to you the range of cognitive challenges associated with ADHD. Where possible, the research I'm presenting is reflecting difficulties associated with ADHD itself, rather than a co-occurring problem such as specific learning disabilities or co-occurring autism spectrum disorder, etc. So these are the types of challenges that have been linked with ADHD itself. After that, because it's helpful to understand these cognitive difficulties, if there are some, it's obviously logically going to impact on learning. Different types of learning, sure, but it will impact on learning. So we talked about this notion of this iceberg. So we're now shifting below the surface, so below what you might see in terms of symptoms, to look at the various types of difficulties. And the classic that's always been sort of associated with ADHD is this term called executive function deficits. How many of you have heard the word executive functions? Yeah, it's almost like everyday parlance. If I asked you to define it, I would say we have as many definitions as people in the room. So this is, I'm going to switch to this initially to the focus on these executive function deficits. What are they? Ha! You put all of these experts, 10 experts, in the field of executive function, nothing to do with ADHD necessarily. 10 experts came up with 33 definitions. So, generally, these executive functions are a set of what we call control processes, things that go on in your head, usually meant to be intentional, so under your control, and they're supported by a part of the brain, the frontal part of the brain, which in turn kind of controls lower level processes. And so that's why executive functions have been linked with this ability to self-regulate your emotions, your behavior, your attention, etc. In everyday parlance, it really refers to what I call desired behaviors that allow you to break out of a habitual and maybe not effective response, to make decisions, evaluate risks, plan for the future, prioritize and sequence actions and decision-making and so on, and cope with novel situations. So I think it's more useful to think of what I call the overall concept. And the trouble is, again, the concept has been muddied and reified by measures. So the measures become the construct. So think first of this umbrella term, and there's lots of what we call different cognitive abilities one could think of, like could you backtrack? Could you now take yourself back in your mind and say, list the things you did in sequence since getting up out of bed? Could you, for example, right now, think of what you have to do and make sure you need to do in the break, the lunch break, in order to see things going on smoothly at home? or this evening. So could you proactively plan for what you've got to do and remind yourself? That will be part of executive functioning. So in a classroom, we could think of this kind of aspect. It's required if you think of a teacher giving a description or explanation of some new content, new information. The youngster has to process the spoken language or the written language, if it's being written on a smart board or whatever, or a textbook, and represent in their head, try to form some mental representation of what the teacher is saying or what they're reading in a textbook. Then they've got to link it, they've got to identify what's critical in this information. In elementary school, as I've sat in so many classrooms, I think I have ADHD sometimes, because sometimes if I kind of drift off a minute, I actually can't differentiate whether it's crowd control language or specific student control language or the content language, because sometimes it's blurred. Okay, we're going to be talking about this new mathematical concept of dodo. Johnny, how many times have I had to tell you? And we're now going to switch and focus on, multiplication. It's like, how does a child know under that? How can they process that? And that's partly this, you need that ability to kind of chunk. Okay, that's a bit, I don't have to pay attention, that's Johnny, that's not me. But this bit is important. So they've got to work out what under the spoken language or what words in the textbook is actually relevant. That's all part of executive functioning. So they've then got to ignore the irrelevant information and environmental distractions. So the fact that Susie is actually braiding my hair, I have to try and ignore while I'm actually trying to focus on my work, because somebody else is jostling, or there's mutterings, or there's things going on. All of that requires self-regulation of attention, monitoring language, whether it's spoken or written, extracting that information and holding it in your head long enough to either kind of link it with existing information or write notes. It's executive functioning. So it has to be, when you're trying to learn, you're often trying to link new information with existing information in your head. And if there's a break there, it's a challenge for learning. But this is a type of executive functions. We know a lot about how it develops normally. So if you think of a young baby, a toddler, say 9 months to 16 months roughly of age, 1.5 years of age, certainly by 1.5, a kid would typically be able to sort of carry out a two-step plan. If I do this, that happens. They kind of understand that means end. If I hit this, there's a noise, whatever. They begin to maintain focus despite distraction, but if you think of babies, they're often kind of pulled away, or toddlers, their attention's pulled away very rapidly. But they're beginning to inhibit all the other stuff to focus a little bit. And under changing circumstances, they're beginning to be able to change plans, but need a lot of external executive function from their caregiver. By 2 to 5-year-old, they should be able to remember 2 rules: shoes here, coat there. Delay eating a treat. So instead of like shoving it in the mouth instantly, they should be able to hold it a little bit in time till mum gives them a serviette or something. They should be able to follow an arbitrary rule. They might not understand the rule, but they should be able to follow it. They should be able to shift in action if there's a change in rules. Adults, obviously, you can juggle multiple tasks and strategies might vary. And the critical thing with an adult is that if your first attempt at something fails, in general, you will rapidly be able to come up with another approach. Children and even young adolescents often have real difficulty coming up with more than one plan. Youngsters with ADHD rarely come up with more than one plan if they had a plan to begin with. And that's the problem. So sometimes encouraging these youngsters just to stop and say, okay, so you could do this, what else could you do? That alone might help the kid through something, because they're slower to do this shifting plans. If you only have one plan, even as an adult, if you only have one plan and cannot generate another, if that plan doesn't work, and this happens repeatedly, you begin to then feel pretty bad about yourself. You think you're a failure. And this is what so often happens with individuals with ADHD, because they don't have a fallback plan. Ideally, you should have 3 possibilities, because usually one of them will work. Otherwise, you start berating yourself if you only have one and it doesn't work. So that's the kind of things to think of. There is a developmental progression, and individuals, children with ADHD, seem to be a little bit delayed in that typical progression in everyday life. But this is where there's a big challenge. How do we measure it? Well, there are 2 ways. One is by these, quote, objective, often standardized tests that are administered in a clinic, often by psychologists. The other are questionnaires that are given to an individual, an older individual, or to a parent or to a teacher to fill out. So you have all these pretty tests, all called tests of executive function. However, it's not always what you think. So majority of these neuropsychological tests, first of all, were developed for adults, and they've kind of been a bit modified and watered down for children, but it wasn't based on child psychology. Second, I have a little interesting anecdote that most of our neuropsychological tests involve these colours, red, blue, yellow, etc. And our current research is showing quite bizarrely that individuals with ADHD might have more problems or slower to process colours blue and yellow. So all that, it means that it might only be a little bit of a problem, but it might explain a little bit of the lower scores. We have, again, a paper in press now that would kind of link towards that. We have several papers on this colour processing issue. The real problem, though, any existing test of executive function that might be administered to a child, an adolescent, or adult with ADHD or any other problem, is that they do test perhaps one specific aspect of executive function, like planning or holding in working memory. So there is a specific aspect, but there also is a more general aspect of executive function. Most of them require something else, so they might require controlled attention. You've got to keep focusing on something, or you might have to make a decision to shift between A and B, but you've got to hold the rule in mind, so that's working memory and a generic thing. They also require non-executive function, which means something like processing information rapidly because things are presented at a pace and you've got to keep up. They also have measurement error. Everything has measurement error. So a score that you might receive on a report that says your child falls in the X percentile and suggesting problems in executive function is correct in one way, but it means that there's also other things that contributed to that low score. So again, we have to be careful when we're measuring and interpreting that tests alone, a test score alone, is not sufficient to really confirm an executive function measure. And you'll see why as we go in the next few slides. There are also rating scales, and I'll just list it up here. It doesn't matter if you can't see the names. There are lots of questionnaires that you might deliver. So as a teacher, you might receive to ask about executive functioning in everyday life. These 2 types of approaches differ. You cannot substitute one for another. That's because if you think of a questionnaire, the questionnaire will ask about, how does your son or daughter or your spouse, or how do you have problems in, remembering where you put things? Do you have problems in keeping track of time or meeting deadlines? Those types of questions. The questions obviously are broad, so they're measuring more than just executive functioning processes, but they also are asking the person, the informant, to rate the behaviour, a little bit, not at all, a little bit, pretty much, etc., over the period of past weeks and months. So you're looking at general performance over the past weeks or months in everyday life. By contrast, these cognitive tests are administered, they're looking at the scoring a person's performance under very artificial, controlled situations, a quiet room, everything else moved away without distractions. And they're also looking at performance, optimum performance, under a very limited time span, meaning sometimes 20 seconds, a few minutes, under artificial control conditions, and often under what I call a pressure of time, responding as quickly as you can. So those two types of measures are totally different. One's sort of like in the here and now, over a short time, and the rating scales, questionnaires, are over a longer time in everyday life when there's no concern about optimal performance, but rather it's performance, how do you do generally? So they measure very different things. You can't use them interchangeably. You can't substitute one for another. Both actually are useful. We won't expect them to be tightly related because they're measuring different things at different over different time frames, under different circumstances. But both should give you information about how this person's executive function is working. In ADHD, when I started the field in the late 1980s, 1990, completely accidentally, by the way, but the whole question that I was hired as a postdoctoral fellow to help find out what's deficit in ADHD. It's called attention deficit disorder. Well, where's the deficit? And everybody was searching for the deficit. As Dr. Seuss's Sneetches, they assumed at this point that you could actually say, okay, an individual with ADHD, let's do it the other way. An individual without ADHD has a star upon Mars, but an individual without ADHD has a deficit, no star. So that's what the whole research focus was on. What's deficient in ADHD? And the whole research base was comparing mostly children with ADHD versus children without ADHD. So that was the focus. And of course, almost by definition, you get guaranteed that the child with ADHD will show the, quote, deficit. But my question was, well, as I assessed all these kids, as I looked at, if I took a group of 50 children with ADHD and compared them to 50 children without ADHD, sure, the group of children with ADHD scored more poorly than those without. But my question was, well, yes, but not all of them did. So how many? And when you say somebody has a working memory deficit, somebody has a planning deficit, or ADHD, is associated with working memory problems, most people would think that the majority of individuals with ADHD would have that problem, correct? Because it says, okay, or ADHD is basically an inhibitory control deficit. They can't stop an action or thought. And so everybody assumes it's about 80, 90%. So, well, with a colleague of mine in Denmark, we said, we kept seeing over and over again, if you actually look at the data, it's not the majority. So what we did was to take a group of youngsters with very, very well diagnosed ADHD, and any co-occurring problems were also recognized, identified, and we controlled for those co-occurring difficulties. Oops. And what happened, there's many different ways. How do you define what's impairment? Some tests give you what we call a particular cutoff score, and anybody below that level has a problem, or above that level, depending on the type of scoring. Some people say, oh, you just have to take the worst, the 10% of the population of that particular sample, the lowest 10% means impairment. There's all different ways of saying who's got a problem and who doesn't have. But it didn't matter whether we used one researcher's definition or another researcher's definition or even a third researcher's definition. These are all these standardized tests of executive function. And I'm not going to even bother to explain all the terminology, but some measure working memory, some measure inhibitory control, etc., or set switching, or various things. And if you look at these percentages, about the highest we see is this one, this quote, finger windows backwards. It's supposedly a measure of a visual spatial working memory. Only less than 50% actually have the deficit. So if you test an individual child and you just have, supposing you're a psychologist and you're very familiar with maybe 3 tests, because you've got limited time and it costs a lot of money to do this. So see, I'm going to use test A, B, and C. It's possible that this youngster before you will not have any impairments on any of those tests. On the other hand, they could have them on all of those tests. So it depends what tests you measure, what sort of the likelihood that the individual before you will be impaired, and depends how you define what means a deficit. Moreover, if we say what proportion of individuals would have impaired executive function, if we take all of those tests, so that was a lot of tests, that would take maybe 3 hours to administer, a lot of testing, a lot of expense. You'd say, well, it actually depends on how you define it, but look at this scenario. So this is looking at the number of executive function tasks you're going to administer. So, and this is the number of tasks on which they're impaired. None, at least one, at least 2 or 3 or 4. If you just said, okay, they need to be impaired on, say, 1, this looks exciting. Look, whoopsie, yes, 83% of individuals in this particular group of individuals, children with ADHD, 83% had an executive function measure on some of those we measured. That's exciting. But, oh, wait a minute, 50% of children without ADHD had the same problem. So that doesn't help. So to actually find a bit more reasonable number, we said, okay, if you give at least 3 measures of executive function, you might capture almost a half of that group of children with ADHD, and just less than 6%, about 6% of kids without ADHD. But what it's telling you is that you've probably got to administer an awful lot of tests because you can't predict what they're likely to be impaired on. So this is the problem with some of the neuropsychological testing. They measure more than what they say, and you've got to know how many tests to administer. How do we know that? I don't know. If you come into my office, I have no idea what to test, and I probably have my own preferences of what to administer. So it's challenging. So moreover, not only do we find, as in the Sneetches, that, yes, we do find that it's, say, inhibitory control or working memory or whatever is in fact deficit in ADHD. This one doesn't have that star. Once we start looking at youngsters with other types of difficulties beyond ADHD, so many others seem to have deficits too. They don't have stars upon theirs. So the reality is this group. So this meta-analysis looked at was, here's all these different types of executive function tasks across the top, lots of names. Down the side here are groups of individuals with different types of problems: ADHD, learning disabilities, particularly dyslexia or reading disability, autism spectrum disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, oppositional conduct disorder, anxiety, tics and Tourette's, childhood schizophrenia. And all of these little crosses mean that it's deficient according to some scoring algorithm. And this study makes sure they were using the same decision about what's impaired or not. And the number of crosses indicated the magnitude of difference between this group of individuals and individuals who are typically developing. But I can't find anywhere along here, I've just highlighted response inhibition, that has dominated the belief of this field of ADHD, that individuals with ADHD can't inhibit, and it's like a specific deficit to ADHD. It's not. It's present in all of these disorders. It's like part of general psychopathology, if you like. So we really haven't been able to find anything. If I just look along the line of ADHD, inhibition is really impaired. If I go to working memory, sure, it's impaired. And of course, when I come down to schizophrenia, it's going to be very impaired because it's a severity issue, not a difference issue. So another study, this is another way of looking at it, so again, replication, that this is looking at, again, a huge array of effect size of the magnitude of the difference between a group of individuals with disorder and a group of individuals typically developing. If we look here, we have depression, I think this is bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, and ADHD. The larger the number, the bigger the difference between that group and ADHD and controls. Schizophrenia has the largest, if we look down here, along this line. No matter what we look at, schizophrenia, the effect size is biggest pretty much across all measures compared to something like ADHD. It's a severity issue, not a unique difference issue. So that's a big important thing. It's not to say they're not impaired in these executive functions, but you can't use those tests to differentiate ADHD from any other disorder. That's a key point. So we know now that individuals with ADHD and groups of individuals with ADHD struggle with a huge variety of cognitive and emotional problems. But there are no known problems that I'm aware of to date that are specific or universal to ADHD, meaning that all individuals with ADHD would have that problem. So you cannot have a little gizmo on your desk called a continuous performance task or your favorite test and say, whoa, failed on that test, that kid therefore has ADHD. It is not possible to rule in or rule out a diagnosis of ADHD on any of these tests. What you can use them for is to say, they're struggling in this aspect of thinking, reasoning. What we do know also is that individuals with ADHD have very poor time perception, and that ranges from an understanding or the ability to demonstrate an understanding of time, meaning in like a fraction of a second, a half a second, a quarter of a second, ranging up to unable to know what a minute is, an hour is, etc. So social time and what we call cognitive time. Individuals as a group with ADHD are impaired in time perception, so they don't have an awareness of time. They also are impaired in reinforcement, like what a general term would be rewards and punishments, but the correct scientific term would be reinforcement. And they seem to be abnormally sensitive to the frequency and saliency of a reinforcer. If it's a negative reinforcer, somebody tells you off or frowns at you, that can completely throw an individual for the day. So negative feedback to a person with ADHD can often have devastating, long-lasting effects, much longer than other people. The other area is that, so they need frequent, immediate, salient, positive. I don't mean giving them, little tokens on the fridge or anything like that. Often it's a social look, a pat on the shoulder, some kind of positive approach to an individual immediately upon desired performance. And it's the tightness of the link between that positive comment or positive touch and the behavior. Because if they've got poor working memory, it's no good saying, I'm going to write a letter to your mum about this. If you don't behave now, I'm going to send you to the principal. Well, by the time they got to the principal and the principal says anything, they won't know what they did to begin with. They just can't make those connections across time. It's impossible. So the reinforcement has to be immediate. Tough if you're a parent or a teacher. It's very difficult to do this. The other aspect is processing self-regulation of emotion. This is really a new area that's suddenly emerging in the field of ADHD, and the challenge is what they're finding is many individuals with ADHD misinterpret emotional expression. So when shown, again, this is under laboratory-controlled conditions, but when shown pictures of a happy face, a sad face, a neutral face, an angry face, etc., many individuals are often reporting that a neutral expression on a face is negative. That's really problematic. That's maybe why they get overreactive. No, their friends aren't actually being negative to them, angry with them, or the parent isn't angry, but just the look at their face is being misinterpreted. So this is concerning. Yes?
And would you also sort of support the idea that they also misinterpret tone of voice?
Oh, yes. So that's, again, a comment here. Would I also say misinterpret tone of voice? Clear evidence, yes. Absolutely. So it's a very complex area. And again, the research base for this is not as broad because it's a new recognition within the field that ADHD is far beyond just behavioral differences, cognitive differences, it's emotional differences, affect regulation and recognition. So if we look at the studies, this one is from England, where they took a large group of children, and what they did, these circles represent the type of cognitive difficulty the individual is manifesting. So the pink, orangey pink colour is what we call delay aversion, not being able to wait. If there's a cookie in front of you, you grab it now. even if you said, if you can hold on, and then you can have a couple. And it was based on this famous marshmallow test where a kid was given this marshmallow and they just left it alone and said, you could have this marshmallow now, or, I've just got to go out for a minute. If you wait till I come back, you can have two. And there's this, if you Google it, there's this wonderful little video of these little preschoolers, because that's the kind of sensitive period. And there's one little boy, he's doing everything. He sniffs around, he kind of pokes it, and then he takes a little pinch of it. He just can't resist. And that actually has a child who literally can't hold that immediate want for something nice, that often is a lifelong trait. It's amazing. It's a very strong predictor. However, only a fifth of children with ADHD have that problem, 26%. This area, this kind of purpley blue area, is executive function. And in this study, only 16% had executive function problems. And down here, this green one, this is time perception, and a third had problems in time perception. However, almost a quarter had none of these deficits on whatever tasks were administered to capture these different areas. So you could see, okay, so if you required something like a cognitive deficit as part of the diagnosis, you're going to miss a bunch of kids. It's also known, as I explained, that yes, ADHD is clearly linked, and any parent or teacher could tell you this, didn't really need researchers, that ADHD have problems in self-regulation of emotion, low frustration tolerance, very impatient, quick to anger, hot-tempered, irritable, and often what we call the roller coaster of emotions can be high as a kite, laughing, giggling, and then suddenly a major outburst, seemingly for no reason. And when they start including both the recognition of emotion and the regulation of emotion, we have a different pattern emerge. Here's another study, I think from Sweden, I think this was. Here, on these three circles here, we again have in this case, about a third of this sample had executive function problems. Some had delay aversion problems, about 14%. And this was just variable performance, usually meaning speed of responding to a computer stimulus, what we call of their reaction time varied, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, and about a quarter had some variability. Very few, 4%, had all three of those. So you see the variety of different problems that emerge, and that would mean very different types of learning difficulties. If, however, we go to this next group of three circles, what they did is to put all the kind of, I call it the executive function, other types of cognitive processing, time perception, etc., in one purple group here. You had probably a bunch of individuals who had problems with these executive functions, if you put all of the other set together. When you look at self-regulation and emotional recognition and emotional self-regulation, you captured a lot more individuals with those problems. Only 7% of this sample of ADHD had none of these problems. So collectively, if you looked at all these range of problems, you've got the majority that would have a deficit, but not necessarily one particular one. So you're beginning to get the picture. It's so variable why one child might look so different to another. Moreover, it's well documented that not only, although a youngster with ADHD, imagine some of these little bouncy boys you see, and some bouncy girls, they might move fast, but they process information slowly. So they need more time to process. You need to repeat things more so that they really get what you said. So they are, in fact, in a sort of school scenario, they often reply more slowly and more variably. They're slow and inaccurate. They're not, as one would predict by the impulsivity, hyperactivity impulsivity name, they are not fast and inaccurate. Very different to what the name would imply. So the other next thing that's tricky, and I don't want to belabor this too much, but there is a notion now emerging in the research field that this, quote, executive function thing is separate from ADHD. It can co-occur with ADHD, but you don't necessarily have to have executive functions deficits in ADHD. So within a school system or a clinical system, it's not necessarily going to be very helpful trying to focus and improve on executive function, because you might improve executive function, it might have no impact on the ADHD. Or you could treat the ADHD, but it might have no impact on the executive functioning. So this particular set here was a large sample of adolescents with ADHD. And what they said was that they're not related. You know, they can occur, you can have one or the other or both, but they're not, doesn't seem to be related. So it suggests the separability of these cognitive difficulties from ADHD. It's really challenging to get our heads around this. And the studies are increasingly showing that executive deficits measured in childhood may not manifest in adolescence or adulthood. So there's often a little bit less impairment. And it could be part of the brain maturation going on. They're kind of beginning to catch up in some ways, but the symptoms continue and impairments continue. And this again is showing what I call a difference between the notion of improvement in ADHD symptoms and improvement in executive function. You have a scenario, you can both have improvement in both, but they don't co-occur. But what we do know is that individuals with ADHD and some of these cognitive difficulties, they're going to be much more severely impaired than a youngster with ADHD without executive function impairments or something. So we can't equate executive function equals ADHD, ADHD equals executive function. We cannot any longer make that statement. They can occur. One might improve and the other might not. So they are different entities, but they are related. Keep that in mind if you try to get your head around it. Okay. Just before I go on, questions about this notion of cognitive difficulties and executive function, because this might have been a bit more challenging. Any questions? Right, one right at the back there. Yes.
If the parent is going to spend $2 or $3 grand to get someone tested for a neuropsych, what do they test, given what you're saying, and also given that I've heard there are some psychologists who are well trained. Some have no training, just like doctors and psychiatrists. So if you're a parent, how do you know what test to choose to find out who's expensive? Because I've had people come to me coaching and they got tested and spent $1 grand on testing, and they said they didn't have ADHD, but I've been coaching them for a while.
Yeah, so the question is, given what I just presented, how is a parent or how is a psychologist to know what tests to use? How is a parent to know how to interpret a report on those cognitive tests? How is a teacher to interpret a report? And why do you get these notions of, often a parent, quite legitimately, based on a report they receive, will say, well, my child has executive functions, or my child does not have executive functions and does not have ADHD, which is completely at odds with another clinical diagnosis or the impression within a particular context, like a classroom. And this is, again, really worries me. Now we have this kind of, I call it states of uncertainty about the link between executive function and ADHD. Because it also makes people suspicious. And instead of saying, well, I don't believe in the executive function tests, will somehow, for some reason, say, well, I think ADHD is a myth. It doesn't exist. And it's almost like it sort of denigrates ADHD, and it really shouldn't. So I worry. I don't think there is a simple answer at the moment, other than to say, the assessment of these various cognitive functions may be useful to guide interventions. They are not useful to rule in or rule out a diagnosis of ADHD. But we can't definitely say that a child who fails one or more executive function tests we cannot definitively state they have a cognitive deficit in process A, B, or C, because if it doesn't relate to their functioning in everyday environment, it's got to be, you should see evidence. If they've got a working memory problem on a test, you should see evidence in the real life. Often what happens is that the youngster, under these controlled conditions, passes these tests, maybe not brilliantly, but they're not scored in what we would say of clinical concern. Yet, if we ask questions in the everyday world and get examples in the everyday world, often on those questionnaires, you will find huge problems in working memory. So again, it's what I call a really tough scenario to understand how to interpret these reports, these tests, the ADHD. But at the moment, I say the best stance is to literally push for a little bit of clarification on both the diagnosis of ADHD and any reports on executive function, and see, is it consistent with your understanding and observation of the child in the context you see the child? That to me just makes sense. And so, I mean, we know this outside the field of ADHD. In medicine, you might be told you've got something or other, but it's like, really? You know, I mean, I remember being diagnosed with something at one point. I said, are you sure it's not like a test error? Because I think I should be dead if I really had that problem. So, you know, it didn't make sense to me. And when they redid the testing, you know, I actually didn't have that problem. Yes?
Is there any confusion between clinical assessment of the qualities that make up ADHD diagnosis and other things like trauma, emotional difficulties? You know, and does that allow you to separate those?
Yeah. So the question, a very good question and very relevant, of increasing relevance these days, is it possible to kind of really differentiate sort of assessment or anything in the assessment of ADHD, the performance, the scores, the diagnosis of ADHD versus any effects of things like trauma? Thinking of so many things going on at the moment, and the children we see coming in are more and more complex as they've often been uprooted, not been in school for years, and so on, and have major trauma. The diagnosis of ADHD can be, because you really do have to do a very good, it's not just symptom counting. A good clinical assessment of ADHD will cover full developmental history, family history, life history, etc., educational history. And that would help a little bit more to rule in and rule out ADHD, even, you know, in the presence of all these symptoms. If there was something odd in the development, or in this case, you know, the report is that, well, this child spent 3 years in a refugee camp without education, you know, seen family members killed, then it would be very worrying to think that diagnosis would proceed without a period of observation, so repeated assessment over time. But obviously, as we know, trauma can have long-lasting effects, so it's tricky. And this is a problem. There is no marker for ADHD. There isn't a test or a blood test we can do to say, that's post-traumatic stress disorder, that's ADHD. We don't have those markers yet. So it's very careful clinical assessment, and it might need what I call monitoring carefully and a reassessment of both things. How is this child settling in? After children are remarkably resilient and flexible and adaptable, even given pretty tough circumstances. And in a settled scenario, one would expect to see a settling down if it's been a sort of trauma-related, not vanish completely, but settling. So it gives you a bit more confidence if there really is ADHD going on. Likely to influence cognitive thinking and cognitive, I guess, perceptions of things will be altered.
Even if it's a home situation where the trauma is essentially continuous, then it would be hard to see a separate.
Yes, because if it's for the comment was if it was a family-related home trauma continuing, you probably would not see things settling. And again, it requires very careful monitoring of the situation of the child. My honest belief, though, whatever your symptoms you see in a child, even if you can't be confident in the precise diagnosis, if a child's struggling, you give help. You don't wait for a diagnosis. You support that kid, no matter what it is, and you try to gradually adjust to where you see things changing and help the child. Okay? Unless I have burning questions, I'll move on to the academics. Sorry, it's going to be a bit rush. Keep in mind, with ADHD, there are two major types of problems that can arise in terms of learning. One type is what I would term academic skills, like learning to read, learning to do arithmetic, learning to write, etc. Those skills are being taught in schools. That is part of the curriculum. The second set of problems which are associated with ADHD is what I've used the word academic enablers. These are things like attitudes, behavior, study skills, engagement skills, interpersonal ability to get on with peers, work in groups. They're rarely taught in schools explicitly, and yet the children are expected to kind of somehow extract these requirements by being in school. So we see with ADHD these two types of problems. With the academic difficulties, we can see a progression, and that's why we need to get in early. Early learners, I've called them sort of 3 to 5 year olds, the preschoolers, will see a state of unreadiness. Anybody here would be able to go into a preschool, a nursery school, and you'll see all these little kids. I call it, they follow like a little sort of swarm of bees, and they all go to A, they all go to B, the teacher says this, and they move together except one or two. They're still rolling themselves in the curtain or doing something else, or splashing in water. They don't seem to get the routine, they don't learn the routine. So 3 months into the program, they're not there. They're a state of what I call unreadiness, and it's very common. You don't know why they're unready, but it's very clear they are unready. So they often manifest problems in a social group, so they just can't kind of go with the group. They don't quite understand the routines. You often find they're not ready in terms of pre-academic readiness. They don't often know the sounds or the shapes of the letters, that kind of thing. Language might be a little bit immature. Lots of sort of strange language, strange intonation patterns, what I call baby talk. Motor coordination problems is evident. At the elementary age, you'll see starting immediately falling behind. Rapidly, upon entry to grade 1, they're not there. They're not up with their peers. As you get older, you get suddenly a drop in low product. So low productivity is perhaps the most characteristic. In order for this kid to put anything on paper, you've got to stand right over their shoulder and almost make their arm move, because they'll get maybe their name, maybe the date, if you're lucky, and maybe one word, but that's it. Everybody else has written a paragraph or a page. So low productivity is often characteristic. Secondary school, in the early secondary school, dropout. Absenteeism, not caring, maybe acting as a clown, etc. And then by sort of older adolescents, really lower standardized test scores, a lot more absenteeism. They're telling you they've had it. They're out of here. And if we let them leave, they are going to be in trouble. Our absolute responsibility is to make sure these youngsters complete their educational system. Without it, they're going to be in trouble. It's not necessarily the standard curriculum that is going to be optimum. It might be some other routes of learning, but to keep them out of what I call some kind of formalized learning, if they drop out of all sorts of formalized learning, we are really putting these kids at even greater risk. I've been fascinated by language because it's totally overlooked in the presence of ADHD symptoms, that we know, and having just done a recent review of this, we know that even in speech, which is the actual sounds one produces, we have problems in fluency and problems in voice quality. By fluency, I mean a youngster who is, say, 6, trying to tell you a story, will go, and it's like, you just get so impatient, you just want to pluck this kid's vocal cords, they get it out. And it's really hard for them. They also have voice quality problems. They're very loud, intense. They can't use their indoor voice. And we'll see it's major problems. Language problems, both in understanding spoken language expressing their ideas in spoken language, and how they use language in a social situation. The voice problems is very strong evidence now that they have vocal hyperfunctioning. We don't understand the cause of this, but they often are hoarse, they're often very loud speaking, they can't modulate their tone. And when you talk about some of the little boys in particular, who are often skinnier than some of the little girls, but we see this incredible sort of the real tension and sort of extension of all their sort of veins and things in their neck. And over time, of course, that's going to result in polyps. So it actually has a major medical implication. In terms of the language, we know that once you start going beyond a word or a short sentence, many individuals with ADHD will struggle with understanding spoken language, particularly if it involves technical language like science terms or math terms or something like that. So in our studies, we found that about kids with ADHD, and these are kids our studies have been based mostly on kids who are 7 to 12, and our estimate based on our research is they miss at least 20% of the key information that is spoken. That's a lot. So it's probably not the case that they won't do as I say, but rather, oops, I didn't know what you said. And so this is why we say, just repeat exactly. Don't add more language, just repeat the language, chunk it, pause between the chunks, and repeat it exactly, not expand. Often, it's very easy in class, in schools, and even at home, that the kid just opt out. They're very effective at using these slide-out strategies. I don't know, can't remember. I don't know, it, maybe, what? Very vague, because it's effortful to retrieve that information. They have great word-finding difficulty, and they use a lot of non-specific reference, like him, he, they, and you haven't a clue to whom they're referring. Some answers are even made up, bless them, and this is really sweet. Some of the boys, particularly, I've been working with, they're trying to give me an answer. I've asked a question, and they're trying their best to give me an answer, and it was something about a book or something, a film they've watched. They just make up the answer, trying to please me. It's actually not even in the text or the book, maybe from their general knowledge, but they're just trying, but it's not right. The other major aspect is use of language, and this is probably contributing a lot to the social problems and why you might feel irritated by interacting with a youngster or an adult with ADHD, because often it's not adjusted to the context. It's too loud, it's too fast, they jump back in, they interrupt, etc. So often it's excessive talking when you're supposed to be listening, or difficulty producing coherent, organized talk when they're required. In general, the starting time, normally within a conversation, if you have to wait half a second, it feels forever. Even a half a second, you expect a response of some sort, even a beginning head nod or eyebrows raised, some indication that the response is coming within half a second. If not, you typically you repeat something, you do what we call repair work. Individuals with ADHD take much longer. And if you don't give them a chance, it contributes to their feeling of failure. They need longer to respond. So we say, count a bit and wait and just look expectantly. And an answer will come. And it might feel out in left field. And if you then say, oh, sorry, can you explain a bit more? The next answer will be closer to what you're expecting. They just can't get to it quickly. So you need to give them a prompt, give them a chance in time and a prompt to give you the correct answer, which usually they have. It just doesn't come out quickly. And they can't adopt the listener's speaker role. They get confused. They tend to dominate conversations, which is why I think it's often you feel as though they're kind of really hitting you in the face. They're not. It's just a difficulty adapting to the situation. Obviously, these language problems continue, and not surprisingly, if you have some of these problems in language early on in the preschool years, it is going to have repercussions when you're starting to learn to read and write. In particular, reading comprehension will be predicted to be difficult for these youngsters. So reading, we know, in ADHD, even in the absence of what we call a specific learning disorder, is difficult for individuals with ADHD, particularly with reading comprehension and reading fluency. The phonological skills are fine. So the ability to read a single word, to sound out of single words is not impaired unless they have a specific learning disability in general. But what it is they read slowly and they have difficulty comprehending and they don't have good strategies for how to overcome this problem. So we know, for example, here, that if you look, this was a longitudinal study of about 2,000 students in Germany with ADHD. Well, it's not ADHD, it's high levels of inattention symptoms and hyperactivity symptoms. So not necessarily a diagnosis, but in that diagnosable range. And over time, from grade 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, we see in terms of their speed of reading words, that this dark line is those with a lot of symptoms of ADHD. That they progress, they develop, but they're always below youngsters without lots of symptoms of ADHD. So the same rate of growth, but impaired. Not surprisingly, if you read slowly, you don't have enough resources left to understand what you're reading. It's more effortful. And so likewise, a big gap between this group of youngsters who have lots of ADHD symptoms, they're really struggling with reading comprehension, do improve, but remain with a big gap between them and their peers without severe symptoms. So again, just to summarize, they have major problems in reading comprehension, particularly when reading silently. So what you don't want to do in elementary school is have silent reading time. If you've got youngsters with reading disability, silent reading, guess what? That means they're going to practice more of what they don't know. They're going to practice their bad habits and inaccurate reading. In ADHD, it's just impossible for them to deal with silent reading. So you read aloud, read to buddies. That is and even even post-secondary education, we recommend that the students read the things aloud or have text-to-speech read aloud to them so that they help process. Anytime the information is long and complex, such as these academic texts, expository texts, instructional texts, very, very difficult. And we recommend instant marking, ideally write directly on the book or on post-it notes. Where is it they don't understand? What vocabulary item don't they understand? Where did they get lost? Just mark it, because it's no good after the fact saying, well, what didn't you understand? They won't remember what they didn't understand. So you have to do it, get them to at least mark areas of difficulty as they go. Reading rate and comprehension, this is just an example of this 21-year-old college student, very bright IQ, a very slow reader in high school and middle school. I really hated to read because it took me a long time, and I would have to read the things over and over again. And this happens in adulthood too. I would find myself at the end of the chapter and not remember anything I read, and I realized I'd have to go back and read it all over again. I got to the point in middle school where I was sick of school and hated going. And note, the reading is slow and effortful, non-interactive. It's not strategic. All they did is read the same way again, and it didn't help. So they have to be taught explicitly some strategies. Written language, reading comprehension and written language is often the sort of subsequent outcome of those youngsters who have early language problems, and early language problems co-occur with ADHD. So we know that complex writing tasks are usually the main mode on which students are evaluated at school, and yet it's going to be the most challenging for ADHD, so they're going to get the lowest grades. And it does not reflect their actual knowledge base and ability. Their writing skills are often so impaired. We know from anecdotal reports about written work, poor work, low productivity, etc., with lots of errors. And now the research evidence is corroborating these anecdotal reports, where about 20% in this particular study, so 1 in 5 students in grades 6 to 8 with ADHD would meet the criteria for DSM for a written language disorder. And yet that would be typically said, it's just part of ADHD. They need specific instruction for writing. Mathematics is the next area. So these bars, the blue bars are ADHD, and many of those blue bars are lower than the kids without ADHD, but mostly in things like calculation, fluency, and so on. And don't forget now in our curriculum, the math curriculum is so verbally based. There are often, if you see a math textbook, even for the younger grades, there is not a number to be seen. It's all words. So you could be doubly, triply penalised. If you've got a language problem or a reading problem, you can have a math problem. Many times they don't understand the key word in a math problem. How many do they have altogether? Altogether does not, in most youngsters, but particularly those with ADHD, they haven't a clue what altogether means, other than we all do something together. They don't know it means, really, in a math term, it means addition or multiplication. They don't get it. So they're often these terms that are just part of this paragraph. They haven't a clue where it is. And think of if you analyse the story problems in current math curricula, it goes against, in opposite directions to how students have, for all of their life up to now, have been taught to read. The topic sentence is at the beginning of a paragraph, etc. The key element of what it's all about is right at the start of the paragraph. In math story problems, the key problem is actually at the end somewhere, and there's a question mark. These youngsters would never think to go to the question mark and walk backwards, to say, okay, so what am I supposed to do? And even if they did, they wouldn't understand altogether how many more than, etc. Those terms might not mean anything. So it's a real major issue, partly emphasised by the change in our approach to teaching math. In our study we did in Peterborough Board with about, I think this was 250 kids, but we also have 500 now, where we followed kids from grades 1 to grades 4, but each kid was followed over 2 years. We can see now that we're not working at diagnosis of ADHD, but these severely inattentive kids, this bottom group here, show that they are progressing in math fluency of simple addition. You're talking about number facts of 10. And yet they're very slow compared to kids without these high level of symptoms, so attentive versus inattentive. Moreover, what really worried us was these dips. This is the summer break. Kids who were markedly inattentive didn't decide to come back from their long summer break with the same skill set. It dropped off. So they catch up again, but with intense instruction and support, but they keep dropping off. Probably because they're not engaging in these types of activities. Sure.
Just ask a question about how you determined children who were attentive versus inattentive.
Oh, this was just on one of these it's a standardized rating scale, but not like, it's one that says, this kid is very good at concentrating, lots of questions. So it was a standardized scale that we would use actually within the diagnosis of ADHD, but we wouldn't base a diagnosis on that.
So the teachers just filled them out?
They just to fill them out. And we also had parent ratings too. But this was based on teacher ratings because we were actually testing the kids' math fluency skills, and then the teachers rated them. The data are pretty similar even if we look at parents' rating skills. So I've just put what the teachers should look for, but it's basically anytime you see a problem emerging in these inattentive youngsters or youngsters with ADHD with math, jump on it fast. Numeracy skills are more important in adult life, actually, and health management than reading skills. So we see here, I just summarize that huge problems in the academic skills and now even in the enablers. Ooh, we're out of time. What we're really noting in these are what we call the enabling skills are very slow, poor development of note-taking skills and study skills. Organizations of materials and binders, absolutely hopeless. You need explicit instruction, and the instruction that's being developed for a few weeks of instruction to support these students is really helping, but it has to be continual. And we worked with one board in Ontario, and they opted to have this as a primary focus for all students transitioning into grade 9. So it wasn't singling out youngsters with ADHD. All teachers, all subjects, and gym teachers, etc., all focused on organisation for the first month and a half. It made a tremendous difference to all students, but particularly those with ADHD. Homework, nightmarish. Finishing it, understanding what it is, and if they've finished it, bringing it in. And managing time is really poor. I give you you can read for yourself this example of problems with organisation. It's just not easily, it's not automatic for these individuals. They do need support. friendships. This is a major issue. Everybody's focused on the symptoms, on their academic skills, and their social skills, to me, are even more worrying, because we know the protective factor for healthy development through adulthood into adulthood is a good friend. You don't need many. You just need to have a solid friendship with somebody, support reciprocal friendship. Here they have problems making friends, keeping friends, they lose friends quickly. Following a peer's conversations, they misinterpret their expression and their tone of voice. They overreact in situations with peers, and the peers can't count on them. And even when treated well managed with medication, it does not alter often the peers' perception of this youngster, despite changes in observed behavior. The other area here that's really beginning to emerge is the risk of ADHD per se for being a victim and or a bully. So this is something we have to watch for. They are vulnerable, but they often may be particularly at risk for being, I don't see how this has come, yeah, this is not bad. Even here, we see a particular risk for being a bully and being a bully victim. It's a real concern. So here's the data. A bully, ADHD itself increases the risk for being a bully and also being a bully and a victim. So this is something, again, it's not all kids with ADHD, and it's not a major increased risk, but fostering good friendships is a major part of managing ADHD. And teachers and parents can play a major role in this by looking for those positives, by commenting on the positives, so that other peers not only see this bouncy kid who forgets things and interferes with their work, but they also see, you mean you like Pokemon Go too? And then they've got a conversation. It's amazing how if a teacher or parent just focuses on the other aspects, the positives, peers pick up on that very quickly. Daytime sleepiness, I'm sure Penny might mention this afternoon, but daytime sleepiness, getting to sleep is a problem, and then being sleepy during the day is a problem. I think I'm going to stop. You have some of the other skills. It was just keeping in mind, if you're a teacher or a physician or a psychologist, keep in mind how parents are feeling by the time they see you. They are overwhelmed, they're frustrated, they feel victimized. They're having to manage the homework, which is a nightmare situation at home. It becomes a major trauma at home, major source of irritability, anger, mismanagement. Parents are having to deal with siblings' need, the sibling who does not have ADHD, who feels left out, who feels it's not fair, they kind of have to bear the brunt of their siblings' ADHD. And often, don't forget, siblings with ADHD might have a smattering of the same problem. It's a real tough issue. Teacher's perspective, so if you're a parent, keep in mind the teacher's perspective. They feel not adequately prepared to handle students with ADHD. They're frustrated by the low productivity, the constant need for reminding this kid, ended up having a very negative attitude. They feel stressed all day. So again, my final slide is think of ADHD. It is dimensional, but for diagnosis is necessary to access services and intervention. Inattention is the biggest risk factor in the academic side of school systems. There is cognitive problems, but varied. You can't predict exactly what they are in any one. Poor academic enablers, poor skill deficit. So they're going to be unready, going to continue to be not at the peer level in most cases, not all, and they'll manifest many problems. This isn't simply a case of he's on medication, everything's fine. Multiple management. Thank you. If anybody has questions, feel free to ask one or two, but I think we're out of time because it's important to get to lunch and get to the next session. So I can handle them individually.
Yeah, so we'll Dr. CADDAC will hang around after if you've got extra questions. So I would sincerely like to thank Dr. CADDAC for presenting for us. Dr. CADDAC has always been a huge supporter of CADDAC, has worked with me personally on a lot of advocacy initiatives both in Ontario and BC, and from what I hear, we may be tackling other provinces in the coming years. Please, again, help me thank you, Dr. Tannen.
And thank you for your attention. You've been amazing.